I'm Alexander Hefner, your host on The Open Mind. You may recall the musical 1776, which was said to be President Nixon's favorite play, though he didn't perform it in 5th grade as I did. Suffice to say, it's mine too. And if you download the soundtrack on iTunes, you'll note virtually every song has keen relevance to our evolving political experience, perhaps none more saliently than Pennsylvania delegate John Dickinson's ode to a rightward-bound American politics, Cool, Cool, Considerate Men. Praise for wealthy aristocrats. With our land, cash in hand, self-command, future planned. Don't forget that most men with nothing would rather protect the possibility of becoming rich than face the reality of being poor. And that's what he warned Continental Congress Chair John Hancock. There's no author more astutely prepared to consider the electoral reality of 2017, our present golden age of inequality, than critic Thomas Frank. His books, What's the Matter with Kansas, How Conservatives Won the Heart of America, and more recently, Listen Liberal, Whatever Happened to the Party of the People, have proven most precocious insights into the corporatist trajectory which America has permanently swung. Thomas Frank and I will explore the current creed of our politics, a resurgence of reality that may have awoken in Kansas, and the ongoing self-examination, or lack thereof, within liberal elite classes. Welcome, Thomas Frank. It's a pleasure to meet you finally.
It's great to be here, Alexander.
So it was John Dickinson who said, "Cool, cool conservative men, the likes of which we may never see again." We see them.
Yeah, oh yeah, yeah. Absolutely, and it's funny that he uses that phrase, cool conservative men. You didn't mention this, but my first book was called The Conquest of Cool. And so my whole career, that came out in 1997, and it was a sort of an alternative understanding of the 1960s. And it launched me, I mean, it was a study of the advertising industry in the 1960s. It seems like a strange thing, a strange way of getting started for someone who today, I'm known for writing about politics, and that's all. But these things are all connected, and that's sort of the larger discovery by society of coolness in the 60s and the 70s, in some weird way, is connected to the great right turn that happened a little bit later. We're not going to go into exactly how it is, but this is my grand theory of recent American history, just so you know.
Can you expound briefly?
Yeah, so you have two big changes happen at the same time, politically. We're going to politics here. Two big changes happened at the same time. Politically speaking, the Republican Party moved way, way, way to the right, beginning in the 1970s. You had this sort of, actually it was earlier than that, Barry Goldwater in the 1960s. And rediscovering sort of free market thought, the sort of what the British would call neoliberalism, rediscovering 19th century economics and that kind of thing. And at the same time, you had the Democratic Party deciding in the early 70s, in the late 60s and the early 70s, when it is utterly enamored with the youth culture of that era. You go back and read their policy statements and their manifestos, utterly enamored with what was happening on college campuses and this kind of thing. And the Democratic Party, this is simultaneous now with the Republicans rediscovering this right-wing past. The Democrats decided they didn't want to be the party of Franklin Roosevelt any longer. And they didn't want to be the party of the New Deal, and they didn't want to be the party of the blue-collar class. This is all, Vietnam is going on all around them, and, all the sort of the tumult of the late 1960s. They didn't want to be that party anymore. They wanted to be a party that spoke to a kind of the sort of young, educated people then coming out of prestigious colleges who were so enlightened. I'm saying that sarcastically. You understand?
I'm unfazed, but I do understand that.
Yeah. And that's who they wanted to be as a party. And they never really looked back, and the Republicans certainly have never looked back. I mean, they've advanced further and further and further down that road. And so, in your show, you're very concerned with the subject of inequality. So am I. This is my life's mission, is to understand how this great democracy of ours let that happen to us. When I was born in the mid-1960s, I mean, the difference between a white-collar worker and a blue-collar worker was mainly a matter of culture and taste and, This guy drove a Buick and this guy drove a Chevy, but they lived next door to each other in the suburbs. They didn't earn what they earned was not a whole lot different one from the other. CEOs didn't make that much more than other white-collar executives, and certainly, not a whole lot more than their blue-collar line workers. I mean, considerably more, but not, not like 400 times or whatever it is today. And this country is the greatest democracy on earth. We're a country that it's not just pro forma democracy, everybody gets to vote. We feel it in our bones. That is who we are as a people. We are profoundly hostile to aristocracy and pretension and arrogance of every kind. Like Thomas Jefferson. Was he in that musical?
He was. I played him.
Oh, really? Okay.
There were several
I was going to mention the musical that I was in, which was The Wizard of Oz, which is a parable of populism.
Absolutely.
Sort of a different chapter in that long, long, winding history. But here we are. We're this great democratic society, and we have chosen this path that has led to basically the social fabric just coming apart.
You decry, lament, acknowledge, sadly, as the abandonment of Franklin Delano Roosevelt and New Deal politics. And to the extent that Bernie Sanders adopted that platform in 2016, he was marginalized.
Yeah.
But Clinton attempted to co-opt it, and no one believed her.
Yeah. You've touched on 4 or 5 really critical themes right there. When I was growing up, the New Deal order was regarded as, that was the consensus, that was the default state of American politics. That's what we would always revert back to when everything else failed and people would go on wild adventures and everything. But we knew that that's who we were as a people. That country that, Franklin Roosevelt had reworked the politics of this country, and that was fixed. That was who we were. But today, when we look back at that period now from, say, 1935 up to, say, 1980, we look at that as an aberration. And in fact, what we've done, and I mean, this is deeply cynical, but more and more people look at it this way, that the New Deal period, the New Deal era, was an aberration. And what we're doing now, returning to this kind of 19th century political, economic distribution of wealth, that's the norm. And here you have, to bring it back to some of the issues that you mentioned in the politics of the present day. Bernie Sanders, fascinating guy. I interviewed Bernie Sanders a couple years ago. The interview was on salon.com. You can read it. I voted for Bernie Sanders in the Democratic primary. You might as well know. Get that out front right away. But to me, Bernie Sanders did not represent radicalism. Bernie Sanders represented the sort of Harry Truman Democratic Party. I mean, the stuff he was promising and that he was making a big deal out of could have easily come out of the mouth of Harry Truman, could easily have been in the Democratic platform in 1948. In fact, some of it was single payer, this kind of thing. And so I didn't think of him as a radical. He always appears in public, by the way, in a suit like this, like the one you're wearing. He's very conservative in his personal tastes and manners. He's not a shocking man. He's not disturbing in the way that Donald Trump is disturbing. And my colleagues in the media back in Washington reacted to him as you would to, it was like an allergic reaction. They despised this guy. They're constantly trying to reject him and categorize him as a marginal figure, someone who's an outsider. And that, I was really interested in that. I wrote a big story about this for Harper's Magazine. I don't know if you saw it, about the media's reaction to Bernie Sanders. And I examined op-eds and editorials that mentioned him in the Washington Post for a 6-month period last year. They were, of course, profoundly negative towards Bernie Sanders, profoundly negative. And I asked myself why that is. Because like I said, he doesn't strike me as, he calls himself a democratic socialist. But if you look at what he's actually advocating, there's nothing too radical there. And like I said, his personal manners and tastes are reassuring, if anything. I mean, he seems like a grandfatherly figure, And what is it about this man? And I tried to understand why they reacted so negatively against him. And what I finally came down to was that Sanders represents a sort of, and this is a Freudian term that I'm using completely wrong, but a return of the repressed. He is this Democratic Party. He represents what the Democratic Party used to be. okay, before the Clinton era, before the 1990s, before they fell in love with Wall Street, before they fell in love with consensus and technology and the white collar class and all the things that we identify with the Democratic Party now. He is a throwback to that Harry Truman past, that the sort of Bill Clinton generation of Democratic politicians, and it's not just politicians, of course, it's an entire generation of public-minded people and thinkers and writers and all that, that they feel like they have put behind them forever. And here he comes, here he comes, this man who, out of this past that they thought was over and locked away and gone and buried, and I'll be damned that he's making terrible problems for a candidate that they regarded as perfect.
I would submit to you, if Sanders did not have what ostensibly was a provincial appeal of being the New Englander, curmudgeon, crusty New Englander.
The accent too. I forgot
the
to
accent
mention
too.
that. Yeah. I like his accent. I think it's charming.
Well, someone with Sanders' authentic politics who does rebel against what you critique in the book as the Democrats' problematic association with inequality. Innovation meets inequality, which is really the dominant thread of American economic success story, which doesn't resonate for the blue collar and even many white collar workers. So to your mind, as the Democrats are considering the path forward, how do they rekindle a successful New Deal?
The first thing is acknowledging that there's a problem. Okay, so I first started talking about this stuff a long time ago. You've got a copy of What's the Matter with Kansas there. That came out in the year 2004 when I started writing about this problem, and it goes back further than that. This is the problem of the blue-collar class abandoning, or particularly the white working class abandoning the Democratic Party in larger and larger numbers over the years, and allowing the Republicans to become dominant. And this begins a long time ago, back in the late 1960s. This is the story of our time. Democrats, by and large, have not acknowledged that that is happening. They've done everything they can to deny that that is happening, and to claim that they don't have to do anything about that problem. And we'll come to why that is eventually. So the first order of business is to acknowledge that there's a problem. And right now, the Democratic Party, by and large, wants to blame what happened to Hillary Clinton on interference by the Russians, the Comey memo, and various other sort of things. And look, some of it is true to a certain degree. What they don't understand, of course it's true. I mean, the Comey, the impact of that was enormous. I remember where I was when I heard it come over the radio. I had actually just left the polling place after voting for Hillary Clinton. I walked out to the car and turned it on. Here's NPR announcing that he had reopened his investigation into her emails, and I'm like, oh my God. But it had an enormous impact. But this is a larger, long-term story that has been going on for decades. And until they understand that, no, they're not going to do anything about it. What could they do? Let's say they were to look at to read some of these books that I've written, or some of the many articles that I've written over the years. Let's say they were to do that, and to understand that this is a problem. What steps would they take? Well, it's incredibly obvious. I mean, we are on a race to the bottom in this country, and we have been for 4 decades. Reverse that. Put that into reverse. Do something about monopolies in this country. I mean, the whole business model of Silicon Valley is monopoly. Do something about that. Do something about the incredible high cost of college tuition. Do something about the fact that it's impossible to form a labor union in this country. I mean, you just start out with those 3 things. I could give you a whole list of other things, like go after the Wall Street banks, do some of the other Bernie Sanders sort of things. These would have an enormous impact on inequality. They would put this 40-year race to the bottom that we've been on, this movement towards greater and greater inequality, put that into reverse almost overnight.
But the quagmire therein is they can't do those things because they're not elected to governorships across this country. They're not in charge of state houses. Yeah. So how do you start from scratch, in effect?
Basically, they have to start over again. Now, when I wrote Listen Liberal, and when I assumed that they were President Obama was still president. He still had a certain amount of authority to do things. And they are in a state of historic wipeout now, historic defeat. By the way, I want to pause for a second and dwell on the irony of this. You talk about inequality on this show a lot. okay? And we can illustrate it in all sorts of different ways. It is striking. Everybody knows what is happening, whether you want to call it inequality or whether you want to call it the hollowing out of the heartland or the, the destruction of the American way of life. And there's all these ways of talking about it. And we've been talking about it for 30 or 40 years in this country as it gets worse all the time. Here's the amazing thing. The party of the left in our system, which is what the Democrats are, the party of the left in our system can't do anything, can't build on that. You'd think they'd be able to, they'd be running up incredible election victories, You'd think they'd be campaigning on this all the time. You'd think they'd be like just whipping the Republicans coast to coast. They're doing the opposite.
The reason they're not competitive, frankly, is they're not listening to you. They're not listening to Drew Weston. They're not listening to George Lakoff.
In 2009, these people were flat on their back. The government was bailing them out. Barack Obama could have done anything he wanted with them. If you look back at the precedent, the great precedent of Franklin Roosevelt, Roosevelt took that opportunity of bailing out all the banks of this country to basically reorganize the financial system of this country in a more democratic way. Obama had that same opportunity, perhaps an even greater opportunity, and he chose not to use it. And so what I always say about that 2009, which I think was the great turning point of this century that we are in, is that we came to the turning point and we didn't make the turn. This man, he had everything going for him. The country had elected him to make this change, and the country expected him to make the change. The Wall Street bankers expected him to make this change, and it didn't happen. And I think that is an enormous missed opportunity that Democrats are going to take a long time living down. By the way, all of this gets back to the center, because I don't think this is necessarily Barack Obama's fault. This is the fault of the Democratic Party. It's the Democratic Party, okay? And Barack Obama he's caught in a lot of different long-term forces and different ways of looking at the world that are not of his own devising, okay? And so when you want to understand what's gone wrong with the Democratic Party, by and large, the theme that most people focus on is the money. And this is huge. This is an important part of how the Democratic Party has changed over the years. They, by and large, reach out to the same category of people that the Republican Party reaches out to, their donors and that sort of thing. But there's a larger shift. Excuse me. There's a larger shift out there that we don't generally talk about. And that's that the Democratic Party understands itself in a different way today than they did at the time of Franklin Roosevelt, or at the time of Lyndon Johnson, or at the time of Harry Truman, or Hubert Humphrey, or any one of these Democrats of eras past that you care to mention. And that is the Democratic Party today really understands itself, and you hinted at this a minute ago, they understand themselves as the party of the representative of affluent, white-collar professionals. And they talk about this all the time, and when they talk about things like innovation, they understand innovation as the property of that class of Americans. Or when they talk about creativity, and you've heard this before, the creative class, they're referring to that same group of people. When they talk about when you ask, why do they do these incredible favors for Silicon Valley? It's because they see them as, that's an industry that is populated by
Dick Cheney,
leaders of this class, or Big Pharma, or Wall Street.
We only have 4 minutes.
We've already run out of time. Are you kidding me? We're just getting warmed up here.
So there are a couple things I want to touch on quickly. Dick Cheney to Halliburton, what Barack Obama to
Citibank,
or Facebook and Amazon, or Democrat. So where do you see hope on the horizon that Democrats will leave this generic identity politics in favor of a more workman-like approach? Where do you see hope in the embodiment of that to rescue the FDR legacy? Do you see any individuals on the horizon?
I actually do see some hope, but you should know that by and large, the attitude of the Democrats is that, of the mainstream leaders of the Democratic Party, is that they did nothing wrong, and they don't have to change. And they look at Donald Trump and they see this incredible buffoon in the White House. I mean, tweeting these insane things, making fun of people and picking these fights, and they say, we don't have to do anything differently. This guy is so awful that in 2 years we're going to sweep back in. So the mainstream view among Democrats is that they don't have to change. However, we mentioned earlier the better deal, Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi's. hey, if you dig down into that, there actually is something really interesting, which not many people have noticed, which is that the Democrats have decided to stand up for antitrust again. This is new. The Democrats haven't talked about antitrust since, like the Carter administration, for a long time ago. And this is a really important change. You have to dig down into the document to see it, but that they have reversed their position on one of the, I think, critical issues of our time. Now, they're just getting started, and they don't really know what they're getting into here yet, but this is critical. This links them up to the party of Jefferson, the party of Jackson, the party of Bryan, the party of Roosevelt. This is one of the great turning points, is when the Democrats decided they weren't going to enforce antitrust anymore under Clinton and then under Obama. Well, now they're reversing course. That's a wonderful thing.
So I must ask you, reversing course in Kansas.
Yeah.
This might also be an example of where a Democrat, there's a former mayor of Wichita running in Kansas, along with a young alum of D.C. politics. Kansas, there's a rebellion in Kansas among Republicans rebelling against austerity politics, who finally woke up to the divestment from education, all municipalities, and said,
Yes.
well, what's the matter with us? And, and now they are
Oh, goodness.
potentially considering not just overriding the veto of a governor, but
I thought they did.
They did.
Yeah.
So they overrode the veto of a governor, and now, but could they be on the cusp of
Something different?
changing course?
I haven't written about the politics in Kansas for a long time. And so I'll let you know when I go back there and do that and look into that. What fascinates me,
I think it's really important for you to go back there soon.
It is absolutely important, and I hope and I hope things work out in the way that you just described. But I wouldn't get my hopes up now. Why? Kansas is, so I'm from Kansas. We didn't mention that, but it's a deeply, profoundly populist state, by which this distrust of authority, this distrust of elites, it runs in people's blood there. And the whole power of the right in Kansas is that they latched onto that. Kansas was once a radical state, not just a left-wing state. Not just a democratic state, radical in the 1890s. And up until about, into the 1910s. You still had radicals running for office there in the 1930s. But the right are the ones that have captured this language and this anti-establishment feel. And that's what I document in What's the Matter with Kansas. Of course, I wrote that 12 years ago now. And it sure looks like this revolution that I described in What's the Matter with Kansas has run its course. Consider the paradox and the irony here. It was what I watched happening in Kansas was a working class blue collar uprising that was determined to take the power in the Republican Party away from your sort of Bob Dole style or moderate Republicans, and hand it over, take it for themselves. And what they wound up getting was Sam Brown back. That was the sort of leader of this rebellion, of this uprising, and then he's done this enormous harm to these very same people.
The morality of abortion trumps voting for your economic security. Do you think that's still the prevalent red state phenomenon, or is
it comes and goes, and here's what I mean by that. So when I wrote that in the early aughts, Kansas was doing okay economically, and so people were able to focus on the culture wars. When you have something like the financial crisis of '08 and the Great Recession that followed, people tend to swing back to economic issues. You saw this, by the way, in the 20s and the 30s. The 1920s was a period obsessed with culture wars. Remember prohibition, and so many other things. This was the great rise of fundamentalism and all that. The Depression comes along in 1929, and that stuff is forgotten like instantly. And and you move to this sort of 1930s style workerist populism. Okay, well, a similar thing happened in our time. Unfortunately for people like me, the Republicans got there, saw this coming and got out ahead of us with the Tea Party movement and caught that that sort of populist wave as well, the sort of economic populism. But now that the economy has pretty much recovered, you'll see people moving back to the culture war issues. But what fascinates me is that the right is able to win now in either situation. Why is that? Let's close with this, Alexander.
Yes.
Why is that? I mean, what explains their like that they're able to, that they win and win and win and win? This is
Whether
this
you're
is
rich or poor, they're
but
voting
this
for
is,
the
this
right.
is a group that the benefits of Republican rule are showered on a very small number of people, you know, a vanishingly small number of people. How are they able to win and win and win all, you know, from the 70s up to today, when they serve this tiny little group of people? And a big part of the answer to that has to be the feebleness of the opposition party. The fact that the party of the left, the nominal party of the left in our system, is not interested in doing what parties of the left used to do.
They got to man up or woman up. Thomas Frank, thanks for being with me today.
It's my pleasure, Alexander.
And thanks to you in the audience. I hope you join us again next time for a thoughtful excursion into the world of ideas. Until then, keep an open mind. Please visit the Open Mind website at 13.org/openmind to view this program online or to access over 1,500 other interviews. And do check us out on Twitter and Facebook at Open Mind TV for updates on future programming.
Continuing production of The Open Mind has been made possible by grants from Ann Olnick, Joan Gans Cooney, the Engelson Family Foundation, Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, the John S. and James L. Knight Foundation, Joanne and Kenneth Wellner Foundation, and to the corporate community Mutual of America.